Hi everyone, welcome back. Today's topic is monopoly. So a lot of people have concerns about monopoly. There are reasons for that. There are also reasons to not panic. We'll talk about those at the end. But to get started, we will think about those three characteristics and some of the main questions that we've asked with every one of the market structures we've talked about in this unit. And now, if you're organizing your thoughts using this table I gave you at the beginning, we're now in the last column on monopoly. The good news is a lot of this will be very familiar because the graphing of it is very much the same as what we did in monopolistic competition. So a lot of it will be familiar and we'll be able to move through it fairly directly. So the three characteristics, as you might guess from the title monopoly, it has to do with a market where there is a single seller. And so the characteristic number 3 about barriers to entry, that usually aligns with the first characteristic about the number of sellers in the market. So why is there only one single seller? Because of high barriers to entry. Right, those two characteristics almost always go together. High barriers to entry, and then there just being one single seller. So then the middle, number 2 characteristic always has to do with the type of product. We're going to say here that there is no close substitute. You're selling a product with no close substitutes. If there was a close substitute, then you're not really the only seller, right, in that market. So it has to be unique enough that nobody else is doing anything quite like it. So those are the three characteristics, right? So you can sort of fill those in, in your table, and you can see how they morph and change as you move from perfect competition to monopoly. Notice that oligopoly had high barriers to entry. It had just a few firms. Now you have just one firm. Right? Those are the main changes. So the graph for monopoly, again, this should look familiar. But if you were selling a good with no close substitute, then presumably the demand for that product will be downward sloping, right? There will be some people who have willing to pay more for it than others. If you have a downward sloping demand curve, then you know from our previous work that the marginal revenue curve is below it and falls faster. And if you, so there's your demand, there's your marginal revenue, then the profit maximizing rule, right? We've used that before. That is always the same. Produce as long as marginal revenue is greater than or equal to marginal cost. So to use the profit maximizing rule up here, you have the marginal revenue curve. You need the marginal cost curve. So let's add in the marginal cost curve. There it is. And now you can find the profit maximizing output level, right there, Q star. And then, like in monopolistic competition, a monopolist can choose his price, but the price must line up with the demand curve, right? So if the monopolist decides that she wants to produce Q star units, then you look up at the demand curve, say, okay, then I can charge P star. So the monopoly price, is there at P star. The monopoly output is at Q star. That's using the profit maximizing rule. And then the next question that we've asked, in each of the times we've graphed a different market structure is this firm earning economic profit? Is the firm earning an economic profit? Well, if you said, I don't know, that's the correct answer, right? We can't tell yet. Is it the case that monopolists are guaranteed to earn economic profit? Well, no. Right? You could be the single seller. You could be the only seller of something so unuseful and ugly and undesired that very few people or no one wants to buy it. So there's not necessarily an economic profit for a monopolist. So in that case, if your average total cost curve looked like this, right, then if you sell at a P star but your average cost is up here, then you're losing money, right? So there's no economic profit there. There you actually have an economic loss. But if your average total cost curve looked more like this, then you do, right? So at Q star, if every unit costs you on average this much and you sell it for P star, then you're earning that much profit per unit, right? That green bar that I just drew, that's your profit per unit. And since you're producing and selling Q star units, then this whole rectangle represents economic profit. So economic profit is possible, but it's not guaranteed. So let's see. Anything else we need to talk about there? I think we've got it. You can earn economic profits, and they can persist. So in monopoly, economic profit can persist over time. Now, it's not guaranteed. You could be a monopolist and break even. You could be a monopolist and lose money. Any of those are possibilities. But it can persist, because remember in the other market structures where we had low barriers to entry, anytime there was economic profit, that invites entry. And in our example in monopolistic competition with the coffee shops, if the existing coffee shops were earning economic profit, other ones wanted to jump in, and that caused the demand curve for the existing shops to decrease until they were just breaking even. Here, right, in the case of monopoly, there are high barriers to entry, and so even though the monopolist may earn economic profit, the high barriers to entry prevent new firms coming in and competing away profits. Prevent new firms from entering and competing away the economic profits. So you sort of put this in a bracket here. So that's why I said that they can persist. You can have them in the long run. We'll touch on that in a moment. You could, like I said, you could just break even as a monopolist, and you could, lose money. Those are all possibilities as well. So the efficiency considerations. Let's go ahead and draw that down here. Price, origin, quantity. Are you achieving allocative and productive efficiency? Remember these from the other market structures? Are you achieving allocative efficiency? Are you achieving productive efficiency? So let's draw the monopolist, and we can have them earning an economic profit just as they were. Here's Q star, here's P star. Right, so this is where the monopolist is going to produce. This is where they will sell. Like P star is the price they will charge. Let's add in the average total cost curve. And now we can answer this question: are you achieving allocative efficiency? Or are you achieving productive efficiency? Well, remember, what is allocative efficiency? Right? That's where the marginal benefit of the last unit produced is equal to the marginal cost of the resources that go into making it. That's what you get in a competitive outcome, right? So remember, the demand curve is really based on the marginal benefit of the final good or service to the consumer. And so if the marginal benefit's reflected on the demand curve, you also have the marginal cost curve. So right here, right, it's at this point right here where you achieve allocative efficiency. Right? So it would be at this outpoint level right here where you achieve allocative efficiency. Let's see, we'll call that, Q1, right, where you achieve allocative efficiency. So we'll say, so in our graph right here, that would be Q1. Do you achieve that here? Well, no, because the monopolist produces at Q star, so you don't achieve allocative efficiency. Now, what about productive efficiency? Do you remember productive efficiency? That's when you minimize the cost of production, right? So that happens at your lowest average total cost, right? So the minimum point on the average total cost curve would be right here. We'll call that Q2, right? So you would on our graph, you'd achieve productive efficiency at this output level, right? We'll call that Q2. Is that where the monopolist produces? No, right? The monopolist is producing right here at Q star. So the answer to this part, productive efficiency, is going to be no. And that shouldn't really be a surprise, because in no market structure since perfect competition have we achieved allocative or productive efficiency. So if we go back up here, sorry for all the scrolling in front of you, but if you go back up here, right, if we're thinking about this bottom part of the matrix here where we're filling this in, efficiency considerations, nope for the allocative, nope for productive, and then long run profit, we already talked about this. It is possible, but not guaranteed. But it's possible in the long run, because even if you're earning short run profits, they can persist over time because the high barriers to entry prevent new market participants from jumping in and competing those profits away. So it is possible, right? It's not guaranteed, but it is possible. Then the graphs, we've already drawn the graphs, right? And they actually line up with the same graphs that we used over here in monopolistic competition. So again, this table I gave you back when we started Perfect Competition, it's just a way of organizing your thoughts and seeing where the assumptions or the characteristics change and what the implications are in terms of long run profit and efficiency. So that is most of Monopoly. The one thing that we have left that I want to talk about here is a table that shows you the sort of pros and cons of Monopoly, the reasons that we are concerned about it, and then the reasons not to always panic or to get too worked up. So let me do this one more time. You need a downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue curve that's below it and falls faster. Here's your marginal cost curve. Here's Q star for the monopolist, right? So this we'll label this specifically QM, right? This is the monopoly quantity. And then since they're price searchers, they'll go up here, and here's P star, right? Or here is the price the monopolist will charge. Now, why is that important? One of the reasons that people dislike Monopoly or are concerned from an efficiency standpoint about Monopoly is because how does it compare to a competitive outcome? Well, a competitive outcome would be where the supply and demand curve cross. And the marginal cost curve is really pretty much at the market supply in this case. So we could think about this point right here. If demand is based on marginal benefit, if the competitive outcome is where things are produced, is where you achieve allocative efficiency, and it's produced all the way up to where the marginal cost of the last unit produced is just equal to the marginal benefit of that final good or service to consumers, then basically this would be the competitive outcome quantity. And if competition forced all the goods to be sold at the marginal cost of producing the last unit, then this would be the price in competition. And so if we ended up here, right, at the competitive output, then what would the consumer and producer surplus look like? Well, we'd have consumer surplus right everywhere below the demand curve and down to the equilibrium price. So you'd have consumer surplus there. And we'll make producer surplus orange, right? Everything above. Meant to fill that in, right? Everything above the supply curve, the marginal cost curve, and up to the equilibrium price, that would be your producer surplus. And right, so at the allocative efficiency, right, at this market outcome, you would maximize let's make a note of that here. You'd maximize can't spell today, economic surplus. So that's fairly basic, right? We've been doing that for a while. But what does the monopolist do? Well, the reason people don't like monopolists is because they have the power to restrict output, right? QM is less than QC, and then they can jack up the price. So the concern about monopolists is that they will restrict output and increase price. So what does that mean in terms of surplus? Well, for the consumer then, the surplus is now, consumers get surplus just in this top triangle, right? So this is consumer surplus under monopoly, right? Because they charge this higher price. And what about producer surplus? Well, producer surplus is everything from that price down to their marginal cost curve, right down to the supply curve. So the producer surplus would be there. So there's this area, and I'm gonna circle this, and then I'll take it out so I don't clutter it. But there's this rectangle right here, right, that used to be consumer surplus, or I shouldn't say used to be, but theoretically under a competitive outcome could be consumer surplus that is captured by the monopolist, right? It becomes producer surplus because of monopoly power that allows them to raise price and restrict output. So it's that rectangle that is transferred from the consumers to the producers, right, in terms of surplus. But then the other thing that's a problem for the economist is what happens to this potential consumer surplus and this potential producer surplus. As you may recall from other applications of this, that is potential surplus that just vanishes, right? Just goes away. And so we call that the deadweight loss. Our concern here is that potential surplus just vanishes. And so this is the deadweight loss, and you could be more specific and call it the deadweight loss of monopoly. And so that's a big part of why people dislike monopoly, because overall efficiency falls as consumers get less and have to pay more. And so in a little table I have here, the case against monopoly, we've covered all of the aspects of this, right? Consumer and producer surplus are not maximized, right? These are not maximized, right? Or at least economic surplus, the sum of these is not maximized, and you have a deadweight loss, right? Those things go together. The deadweight loss is the reduction in economic surplus, and you don't achieve either of the measures of efficiency. And this not achieving allocative efficiency sort of plays right back up into this. So there's several ways of describing the same thing. That is, a monopolist, somebody with market power, may restrict output and raise the price to the detriment of consumers. That's the case against monopoly. Now, just a few things to think about, right? Just to sort of, provide an alternative, and how you think about this, an alternative perspective. How much monopoly is there? How many true cases of monopoly exist? There are certainly situations with market power, and you may come up with some examples of monopoly. But the number of cases of pure monopoly where there aren't close substitutes, I think, are fairly limited. And technology is always allowing people to try to break down barriers to entry and find other ways to compete. So, for example, local cable companies. Local cable companies have a regulated monopoly, right? Only one cable company, exists, and just because of the infrastructure costs, right, and stringing all the lines and setting it up, only one cable company will exist in a particular area, neighborhood. That's, by definition, a monopoly. But at the same time, cable always had to compete against over-the-air broadcasts, but cable can offer a lot more shows, right? A wider variety, and can show things that can't be broadcast. So that's, is over-the-air broadcasting a close substitute for cable? Maybe not. But over time, if people found technologies that allowed them to compete. So there were initially these enormous satellite dishes that some people got. Then you got the smaller ones that went on your roof, and there were a couple different companies that offer those, Dish Network and I don't know, Dish TV, I forget what the other one's called. So a couple different companies that offer those small dishes. On top of that, if you get your internet through a different source now, there's a lot of streaming services that are alternatives to cable as well. So is the local cable company a monopoly? It depends maybe on how you define it, but it's hard to say that there are no close substitutes for cable. So there's also an idea of creative destruction, and I'm going to write his name down here, but you don't need to remember it, or necessarily tuck it away. But if you're interested, there is an economist named Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, and he coined this phrase, creative destruction, and it talks about how people are always innovating and trying to improve things and trying to break down those barriers to entry. And so so just because there might be a monopoly at one point in time doesn't mean it won't be destroyed when people find new and better ways to do things. So the local telephone company, used to be a monopoly, and they had a certain way of doing things. At a point in time, they hired operators who plugged in wires and connected people together. Over time, there was automatic dialing, and that decreased the need for that particular job. Those jobs were lost. And then over time, we had cell phones and whole other ways of communicating over the internet, voice over internet protocols, and the value of the local telephone monopoly is greatly decreased. And so there are always these changes that are changing how we do things, changing how people are employed. Recently in New York, we've eliminated toll takers on the thruway, and it's now all done electronically, either through E-ZPass or through photographing cars and sending them bills. So people are still employed, but people are employed building technology, installing and maintaining technology, processing those photographs, mailing them out, processing payments. People are no longer employed standing there breathing in the fumes of all the cars that go by and handing out tickets and collecting tolls. So that's an example of creative destruction. On top of that, if you think back to the list of barriers to entry, one of them are government-created barriers like IP law, intellectual property law. Think copyrights, trademarks, patents. And patents are created by government. So there's a little bit of an irony, or at least a tension, in D.C. In D.C. on Constitution Avenue, you have the Federal Trade Commission, you have the Department of Justice, Antitrust Division. They're all trying to protect consumers from monopoly. Across the river in Alexandria, you have the Patent and Trademark Office. Their whole job is setting up little monopolies. Now, they're monopolies for a limited amount of time, but they're still creating monopolies. And so there must be some argument for that. And the argument for that is that this creates incentives for people to spend a lot of time and energy in R&D, right? And that monopoly profits fund innovation and research, and they come up with ideas that make us better off, that can shift out the PPF and make all of us better off. And so there is an argument for that. Now, people can debate it. It's a good policy question. I'm not trying to suggest that I have all the answers and everybody should think like me. That's certainly not the case. But I think that it's good for us to understand the arguments against monopoly and also the arguments for monopoly, at least in certain cases, and even in others to question how much monopoly is out there and how long it persists. I think those are fair questions that we should, think about, that you should engage your brain and consider. And so with that, we're going to wrap up the section on monopoly. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to follow up.